In the summer of 1874, a man named John Randolph was hiking through the remote Colorado wilderness when he noticed a terrible smell. He followed the scent off the trail, navigating through the dense pine trees, until he stumbled into a small, dark clearing. It was an abandoned campsite. Laying right in the middle of the camp were 5 dead men, lined up perfectly in a row. Their bodies were in completely different states of decay. 2 had been reduced to almost bare skeletons. The other 3 appeared to have died much more recently, and their chests had been surgically cut open with absolute precision. To understand how they got there, we have to rewind 2 months. In February, a group of 6 gold prospectors had become trapped in a western Colorado valley. Relentless winter storms were dumping up to 6 feet of snow at a time, completely locking them in. The men were poor, and they knew the spring thaw would bring heavy competition. They needed to reach the gold-rich areas around Breckenridge before anyone else. The prospect of wealth pushed them to risk leaving the safety of the valley and hike out into the deep winter. The physical evidence John Randolph discovered creates a series of contradictions that defy the standard logic of a survival situation. The varying decay of the bodies and the surgical nature of the wounds suggest a timeline and a set of behaviors that traditional forensic models struggle to explain. Before they left the valley, the group received a lifeline. A Native American leader of the Ute tribe, Chief Ouray, drew them a map. He explicitly warned them not to attempt crossing the San Juan mountain range. He told them the mountains were impassable in winter, and that going over them would mean certain death. The men ignored the warning. They packed their minimal supplies and marched directly up into the Taboo Mountains, and completely vanished into the snowstorms. For 2 months, no one heard a word from them. Then, in mid-April, a single man kicked open the door of a remote log cabin outpost. It was Alfred Packer, one of the original 6. He was deeply disheveled, gripping a rifle and a metal coffee pot, and his eyes darted frantically around the room. He claimed his crew had abandoned him and that he was the sole survivor of the expedition. We must evaluate how the other 5 men ended up butchered in that clearing. If we map out the possibilities, we are left with this decision tree. There are 3 main frameworks to explain the anomalies at the camp: extreme survival, psychopathy, and Wendigo psychosis. Your choice comes with a severe trade-off. You are going to have to compromise either hard empirical evidence or basic psychological logic. Let's test the first option, extreme survival. The setup is straightforward. We have 6 men trapped in relentless winter storms for 2 months, carrying 0 food rations. This chart helps us map the logic against the facts. On a purely biological level, starving humans will consume human flesh to prevent their own death. If we plot this out, extreme survival lands firmly on the rational side. But this logic breaks down when investigators found a dead deer right next to where the men were butchered. A person dying of starvation seeks the easiest possible calorie source. They will not bypass a readily available animal carcass to expend massive amounts of physical energy murdering and carving up a human being. The extreme survivalist theory makes perfect sense in a vacuum, but once you introduce the physical presence of an alternative food source at the site, the entire framework collapses. So we move to the psychological profiling theory. Consider Alfred Packer's position in the group. He was highly marginalized, actively mocked for his epilepsy, and suddenly isolated in the wilderness with 5 weakened, vulnerable men. The forensics at the campsite strongly suggest premeditated murder. 4 of the 5 victims showed 0 signs of struggle. The layout implies they were methodically executed while they were sleeping. Furthermore, the cuts on the bodies lacked the frantic, messy nature of a desperate attack. The flesh was removed with the surgical precision of a butcher preparing meat. Let's update our chart. Because this accounts for the methodical nature of the killings and the ignored deer, the psychopath framework aligns much better with the physical forensics, while still remaining entirely rational. However, this requires a massive compromise. You have to believe that a man with 0 history of violent crime spontaneously decided to build and execute a psychological torture camp in a blizzard. The psychopathy model fits the exact layout of the bodies, but you have to write off Packer's entire previous life as a deception. This brings us to the third framework, which relies on the inputs of folklore. The group explicitly ignored native wisdom, violated a strict geographical boundary, and endured prolonged isolation in a taboo winter environment. In regional folklore, these specific conditions trigger Wendigo psychosis. It is a cultural syndrome causing an unnatural, insatiable craving for human flesh. This dark compulsion explicitly overrides all other available sources of food. This is the only framework that explains the camp's most glaring anomaly. It effortlessly solves the problem of why a starving man would leave a dead deer completely untouched while butchering his companions. Packer's own statements reinforce this behavior. When he was questioned by authorities, he did not claim total starvation as his only motive. He explicitly admitted that he grew to like the taste of human meat. Looking at our chart one last time, Wendigo psychosis lands far out on the supernatural axis, but it aligns perfectly with the physical evidence found at the camp. The trade-off here is steep. This theory answers every single physical contradiction Packer left behind, but accepting it means you must completely abandon modern empirical science in favor of the paranormal. The enduring horror of the San Juan camp is that no single rational explanation cleanly closes the case. No matter which path you take, you are left with massive logical gaps. Here is how you weigh your decision. If you are a strict pragmatist, the psychopathy model is your most logical conclusion. You accept the premeditation, but entirely write off Packer's previous psychological history as a fluke. If you let the environment dictate the outcome, you fall under the folklore model. You perfectly explain the ignored deer, but you completely abandon forensic realities to get there. Depending on how you prefer to categorize human evil, you have to make a painful logical sacrifice to understand what actually happened in that clearing. Chief Array provided the group with clear instructions that would have kept them alive. Simply heeding that initial warning would have prevented these men from ever being tested by this impossible psychological trap. The San Juan records reveal a sequence of human actions that are entirely detached from logic and the instinct for self-preservation. When empirical science fails to explain why a man would choose human flesh over available game, the ancient warnings of the Ute tribe remain the only framework that accounts for